Question number 1 comes from Brandon. Brandon asks, I'm having a hard time understanding if my breathing mechanics are still dysfunctional. It's hard to tell if my ribs are expanding like you have said that they should. Am I doing something wrong? Also, I've heard that when you are exhaling, that it can help to gently pull your navel inward. Is that okay? Really interesting questions. I like this. So one of the things that Patrick talks about is that there are 3 components that are highly effective in helping to stimulate and change the nervous system and to engage the vagal brake and the parasympathetic nervous system. And these are to change biomechanics, biochemistry, and cadence. We're not going to focus on biochemistry or cadence right now because the question here is really about the biomechanics. And biomechanics are so incredibly important. In the field of heart rate variability biofeedback that I've been in for a very long time, that typically is a topic that isn't discussed as much, or it's not discussed in as much detail as need be had. And this can be quite problematic. Let me explain. The one thing that happens when people become extremely anxious and over time that anxiety builds or that stress builds is that people typically will take shorter, less tidal volume breaths. And what I mean by that is that shorter breaths are typically more thoracic. They come from the chest. So when you see somebody having a panic attack, which is really the most extreme version of anxiety, is that these individuals will breathe very fast, very rapidly from the chest or even sometimes from the shoulders. You see the shoulders going up and down. Again, that's more panic attack, but that's what we see. Or it comes from the chest. Now, for most people, this typically will happen automatically, without thought, subconsciously. They're not really thinking about regulating it, and it just comes from the chest. Another thing that happens automatically for a lot of people is that instead of breathing nasally, which we know is quite effective in boosting nitric oxide and helping with slowing down the pace of breathing and resistance of breathing, we know that a lot of people will transition from nose to mouth. So this combination of thoracic chest breathing, rapid breathing, as well as mouth breathing is basically a physiological and a psychophysiological recipe for disaster. So what we really want to do is inherently change the mechanics of breathing. For a really long time, a lot of yogis and a lot of other individuals who are in breath work were teaching this concept of breathing deep and low, so low and slow breathing, what we call LSD breathing. I listened to that podcast I did with David Jackson on that. We talk about LSD breathing, which is not a drug-induced breathing, but is actually that low, slow diaphragmatic breathing. The concept was typically taught of like putting the hand on the navel or just below the navel or just above the navel. And then when we inhale, feel that hand moving in an outward direction. Now, one of the problems that can happen when people do that is that, yes, they're getting air down low within the bottom part of the lungs and allowing the stomach to come out, but a lot of times it feels forceful for individuals. It's stressful. And we'll see heart rate variability go down when people do that because they're inhaling and they're almost like trying to actively push the stomach out, actively trying to use pressure to engage the stomach. And that is typically not quite effective. Yes, they see the hand going back and forth, but for a lot of people, it doesn't feel good. And then their biometric data would actually indicate that it's not working very effectively for them. So there are some people, though, who will make that transition and they can do it effectively. So when Brandon asks, like, I can't tell if I'm expanding, my ribs the right way, this is actually what we call lateral expansion of the ribs, which Patrick talks about. So instead of putting the hand on the belly where you can have some of those problematic issues of force, we can actually put the hands on the rib cage. And when we inhale, we want to feel the lateral expansion. So you want to feel the hands go in an outward direction. And that outward direction is actually indicative of an expansion of the lungs. It's activating the diaphragm by pushing it downward toward the pelvic floor and allowing for a more low and slow, deep breath. So that's what we are really referring to when we say deep. So for Brandon, for you, if you're not feeling the rib cage, it's hard to see me on the webcam, so I'm going to put up higher. If you're not feeling the rib cage going outward and inward on the breath, then that would be one thing that I would really hone in and focus in on, is seeing whether or not, sorry, somebody outside just started some, it's really early in the morning, but somebody started their construction work nice and early in the morning. One thing that you want to feel, again, is just those hands moving in and out. And again, one thing you don't want to try to do is actively expand it. But what I have found is that if you try to actively expand it by like volitionally, like trying to put pressure on it, kind of like you can do with your stomach, it's a lot harder to actually make it move. But when you engage in a real good, low, slow, deep breath, you'll feel the lateral expansion of the ribs. So I do like that as the main feel as opposed to the hand on the stomach. But one thing that I will say, it's my caveat to all this, is that you don't want to get hung up on this idea of having to engage in the perfect mechanics, because that really takes your focus away and the mindset away. If we get kind of focused on this perfectionistic idea or mindset of what it should be or what it should feel like, then a lot of the times you're going to see that it's going to stress you out more, and that the effects of the breathing pattern aren't going to be nearly as effective in reducing your stress response, may even induce it, if you will. You may see heart rate variability go down or heart rate go up. Those are problems that we really want to try and avoid. So the biggest thing, again, when we talk about breathing mechanics being dysfunctional, what we really want to do here is to move away from this thoracic breathing, from mouth breathing, from clavicle or shoulder-based breathing, and really go down deep and activate the diaphragm. And this is a process that's not that difficult. We were physiologically meant to do this and made to do this. So it is not one that is difficult inherently for the body to adjust to, but it does take some time if the body is adjusted to a more stress-based version of breathing. So that's my thoughts there. Now, in regards to the gentle pull of the navel, this is a really interesting one, because I found a subsection of individuals who find this to be really effective, like a gentle pull. The one problem, though, that you can have is that, again, we use too much volition. We start trying to rip the navel towards the spine. And when we do that, then we end up losing the pace of breathing. We lose the smoothness and rhythm of the breathing. And that can affect the nervous system pretty substantially. So what I would say is that if you do use a pull of the navel, it's just a simple, gentle pull towards the spine. It's not let me try to actively really pull the navel in towards the spine. It's a gentle pull. I have actually used a technique that I find to be quite effective most of the time for me. And I've found a lot of other people that it's very effective as well. It doesn't mean it's always effective, but there's an insertion that you can feel where kind of the top part of your abs or your abdomen, it meets kind of like that cross of the rib cage. And when I say kind of the cross of the rib cage, it's kind of like where the ribs stop and where the open space begins, and it kind of operates like almost like a V shape right there, or maybe even more like a U shape there. Now that open space where you can kind of push pressure in and you don't feel bone, I've actually noticed that for myself, when I visualize that spot and gently pull from that spot, I actually feel a significant difference there and see a significant difference in heart rate variability. And that's more effective for me than focusing lower and in the navel. It's actually focusing a bit higher. Now, there is nothing that I am aware of in the research or in the literature that indicates that that's a formalized technique, that's one that inherently will change physiology. And for me, it's an interesting one because I just subjectively feel better, and I see objective data that changes when I have a gentle, slight pull from that upper part of my abdomen as opposed to my navel. Because when I focus on my navel, I almost feel like I'm sucking in, like almost like I'm trying to it's like, you're sucking in your belly. Like, if you're trying to fit yourself into some tight pants or something, I get that feel a little bit more. And so I just don't like it. It's a little bit more of a discomfortable feel, or an uncomfortable feel. Discomfortable, I don't think that's the word. Uncomfortable feel. So that's what I go with. I think for most people, though, I've seen there is more effectiveness in changing their physiology and changing their self-report or subjective response when they engage in a completely just like volitionally passive breath, where they're not trying to manipulate different parts of their body. They're focusing on different parts of the body, but they're not actually trying to actively manipulate. For a lot of people, that works effectively. And the reason being is because they can engage in a more realistic, smooth, non-adjusted type breath. And the body resonates with that. The heart resonates with that when the lungs feel kind of that smoothness factor and they're not being kind of pushed and pulled, which could offset that rhythm. So again, this is why you try and you practice and you experiment. It's because there are certain things that are going to be effective and work for you, and there's certain things that are not. So Brandon, that's a great question. I really like it because I think that it's asking about mechanics, and mechanics are very subjective. There are some general rules of thumbs, but it's all about just kind of practice and experimenting. And the only way you can do that is by using Hanu and tracking your data, but also checking in subjectively with how it feels in that given moment. So great one. Thanks for listening to the Hanu Health Podcast. We hope you enjoyed the show. This podcast would not happen without listeners and supporters like you. And the best way to support us and the show is to head on over to iTunes and provide us with a 5-star review. This helps us reach others and spread the good word of breathing and stress resiliency. If we read your 5-star review on air, please reach out to podcast@hanuhealth.com with your name and mailing address, and we will send you some sweet Hanu gear. Until next time, breathe better and stress less.